Midnight, the Mekong Delta, 1967. 7 Americans slip beneath water so black you cannot see your hand in front of your face. No dog tags, no uniforms, no official orders. If they are captured tonight, the United States government will swear they never existed. 45 minutes later, a Viet Cong commander vanishes from his bed. No gunshots, no footprints, no evidence. Just an empty hammock and the smell of river mud. The Viet Cong called them the men who breathe underwater. Some enemy units genuinely believed these Americans were not human. And here is the terrifying part. That is exactly what the SEALs wanted them to think. Today, I am going to show you the secret war that the Pentagon buried for 50 years. The missions that never appeared in any official log. The weapons that technically did not exist. And the psychological warfare program so effective that hardened guerrilla fighters abandoned entire regions rather than risk encountering these phantoms. Why did the official records list 153 missions when the real number was closer to 600? What happened on those Phoenix program operations that remain classified to this day? And why did enemy commanders write in their intelligence reports that the Americans had men who could see in the darkness and move without sound? Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War. This is the true story of the men with green faces. The Mekong Delta, 1967. Midnight. The water is black as crude oil, and somewhere beneath that surface, 7 Americans are moving without a single ripple. No boots, no dog tags, no insignia. If they are captured tonight, the United States government will deny they ever existed. These are not soldiers in any traditional sense. They are something far more terrifying. They are Navy SEALs, and, in approximately 45 minutes, a Viet Cong tax collector who has been bleeding 3 villages dry will simply vanish from the face of the earth. His bodyguards will find nothing. No shell casings, no footprints, no evidence that anyone was ever there. Just an empty hammock and the faint smell of river mud. Welcome to the secret war that the Pentagon tried to bury for 50 years. But this was only the first layer of a nightmare that would haunt the enemy for years to come. The Viet Cong, those hardened guerrilla fighters who had defeated the French and were grinding down the entire United States Army, developed a special name for these phantoms who came from the water. They called them the men with green faces. Some units reported that the SEALs could breathe underwater. Others swore they were not human at all. This was not superstition. This was pure, calculated terror, and the SEALs had engineered it deliberately. Every beard they grew, every rule they broke, every piece of black pajamas they wore instead of standard-issue uniforms was designed for one purpose: psychological annihilation. And yet, the most disturbing truth was still hidden from view. The official records show that Navy SEALs conducted approximately 153 direct action missions in the Mekong Delta between 1966 and 1972. The unofficial records, the ones that were classified for decades, suggest the real number was closer to 600. The difference? Phoenix program operations, assassination missions, snatch and grab jobs that were considered too politically sensitive to acknowledge. These were the missions where SEALs would infiltrate a village, extract a single high-value target from his bed, and disappear back into the swamp before dawn. No firefight, no air support, no witnesses. But the rabbit hole went much deeper than anyone imagined. This is not a story about statistics. This is a story about how a handful of American warriors became the most feared men in Southeast Asia. It is a story about the price they paid for that reputation. And it is a story about why, 50 years later, the Pentagon still has not declassified certain operations that took place in the rivers and swamps of Vietnam. What were they hiding? Who were they protecting? And what really happened on those moonless nights when the men with green faces rose from the water? The answer begins in a place called Coronado, California, where the Navy was about to create a monster. The year was 1962, and President John F. Kennedy had just issued a direct challenge to the United States military. The Cold War was evolving. The Soviets were funding guerrilla movements across the globe, and conventional forces were proving useless against them. Kennedy wanted something different. He wanted unconventional warriors who could operate in small teams behind enemy lines without support. He wanted men who could win dirty wars without starting World War III. And what he got exceeded his wildest expectations. The Navy's answer was SEAL Team 1 and SEAL Team 2, activated on January 1st of that year. The acronym stood for Sea, Air, and Land, and it was not chosen by accident. These operators would be expected to infiltrate from any environment and fight in any terrain. They were the ultimate amphibious predators. But the SEALs were not created from nothing. They evolved from the underwater demolition teams of World War II, the legendary frogmen who had cleared the beaches of Normandy and Iwo Jima. But the new breed would make their predecessors look like amateurs. Those men had already proven that small units of highly trained swimmers could accomplish what entire battalions could not. The SEAL program took that foundation and added something more dangerous: direct action capability, sabotage, reconnaissance, and, when necessary, targeted elimination of enemy leadership. The frogmen had been specialists. The SEALs would be complete weapon systems wrapped in human skin. The selection process was deliberately designed to break men. Basic underwater demolition. SEAL training, known as BUD/S, had an attrition rate that hovered around 80%. 8 out of every 10 men who started the program would quit or be eliminated before graduation. The instructors were not looking for the strongest candidates or the fastest swimmers. They were looking for something that could not be measured on any physical test. They called it the fire, that inexplicable quality that made a man keep moving when every cell in his body was screaming for him to stop. That quality would soon be tested in the jungles of hell itself. The first SEAL advisors arrived in South Vietnam in 1962, just months after the teams were officially commissioned. Their initial mission was training, not combat. They were supposed to teach the South Vietnamese Navy how to conduct small unit operations against the Viet Cong. But the advisors quickly discovered something disturbing. The enemy they were facing was not a ragtag collection of farmers with rifles. What they found instead would change American special operations forever. The Viet Cong had developed a sophisticated infrastructure that stretched across the entire Mekong Delta. They had tax collectors who extorted money from every village. They had political officers who recruited new fighters and executed collaborators. They had supply lines that moved weapons and rice through a maze of canals and rivers that no conventional force could navigate. And they had one enormous advantage: they knew the terrain better than anyone alive. But the SEALs were about to turn that advantage into a fatal weakness. The Mekong Delta was a nightmare for American forces. Imagine a landscape where the line between land and water simply did not exist. During the wet season, entire provinces would disappear beneath the flood. Rice paddies stretched to the horizon, broken only by dense clusters of nipa palm and mangrove. The canals numbered in the thousands, and most of them were not on any map. A conventional Army unit operating in this environment was essentially blind, deaf, and helpless. And then the SEALs arrived and saw something everyone else had missed. They would splash through the paddies in broad daylight, announcing their presence to every enemy scout within 10 miles. They would set up fire bases that became static targets. They would call in airstrikes that created new Viet Cong recruits with every bomb. It was a losing strategy, and everyone knew it. But the SEALs looked at that same impossible terrain and recognized it for what it truly was: the perfect hunting ground. Because the Viet Cong had made one fatal assumption. They believed the Americans could not operate in the water the way they did. They believed the rivers and canals were their sanctuary, their highway system, their escape route. The SEALs were about to prove them catastrophically wrong. The transformation began almost immediately. Standard Navy and Army regulations went out the window. SEALs stopped wearing boots because boots made noise and held water. They wrapped their feet in canvas or went completely barefoot. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what came next. They stopped wearing helmets because helmets limited peripheral vision and reflected moonlight. They stopped carrying standard M16 rifles because the M16 was unreliable in wet conditions and not powerful enough for close-quarters jungle combat. Instead, they adopted a weapon that would become their signature: the Stoner 63 light machine gun. This remarkable firearm could be configured as an assault rifle, a carbine, or a belt-fed automatic weapon depending on mission requirements. And that was just the beginning of their arsenal of terror. It was lighter than the M60, more reliable than the M16, and capable of laying down a devastating volume of fire that could shred an ambush before the enemy knew what was happening. The SEALs loved it so much that they kept using it years after the Army had abandoned the platform. But the Stoner was not the only exotic tool in the SEAL arsenal. The teams quickly developed a reputation for using whatever worked, regardless of whether it was officially approved. The weapons they carried would make any armory officer faint. They carried sawed-off shotguns, loaded with double-aught buckshot, for clearing bunkers. They used Smith & Wesson Model 29 revolvers in .44 Magnum because the heavy rounds would not be deflected by jungle vegetation. They adopted the Swedish K submachine gun because it was quieter than American alternatives and easier to maintain in humid conditions. And for the most sensitive missions, they employed the weapon that would become legendary: the Mark 22 Hush Puppy. This pistol earned its darkly humorous name for a very specific reason. This suppressed pistol was specifically designed for eliminating enemy sentries and guard dogs without alerting the rest of a compound. The name was darkly humorous. The reality was anything but. The SEALs also revolutionized their approach to camouflage and concealment. Standard Army face paint came in two colors and was designed for temperate woodland environments. It was essentially useless in Vietnam. What they created instead became the stuff of nightmares. SEAL operators began mixing their own formulas, using grease paint, mud, and even charcoal to create patterns that broke up their facial features completely. The result was the iconic green face that would terrify the enemy for years to come. Combined with tiger-stripe camouflage uniforms that the SEALs acquired from South Vietnamese sources, these operators could virtually disappear into the jungle and swamp environment. Regular Army soldiers who encountered SEALs in the field often described them as looking like something from another planet. That was exactly the effect they wanted. But equipment and camouflage were only part of the equation. The SEALs also developed tactical doctrines that no other American unit could match. They perfected the art of the night insertion. A typical mission would begin with a riverine patrol boat dropping the team several kilometers from their objective. The SEALs would slip over the side without a sound and swim to shore using a technique that produced no splash and no ripple. What happened next defied everything the enemy thought they knew. They would then move overland through terrain that the Viet Cong considered impassable, navigating by compass and memorized maps in complete darkness. The entire insertion might take 4 or 5 hours, but at the end of it, 7 heavily armed Americans would be positioned within striking distance of an enemy target, and no one would have any idea they were there. The ambush tactics were equally devastating. The enemy never saw what hit them. SEALs learned to identify the trails and waterways that the Viet Cong used for movement, and they would set up killing zones that offered no escape. The typical SEAL ambush was not a prolonged firefight. It was a sudden, overwhelming burst of violence that lasted seconds. The team would wait in absolute silence, sometimes for hours, until the enemy entered the kill zone. Then every weapon would open up simultaneously. By the time the first shot registered, it was already over. Claymore mines would shred the front and rear of the enemy column, trapping the survivors in a crossfire of automatic weapons. By the time the first Viet Cong soldier could raise his weapon to return fire, the engagement was finished. The SEALs would then conduct a rapid search of the target area, gather any intelligence materials, and vanish back into the night before reinforcements could arrive. The entire engagement might last less than 2 minutes. This was not how the American military was supposed to fight. The Army doctrine emphasized firepower, maneuver, and the application of overwhelming force. The SEALs had rewritten the rules. They had become guerrillas fighting guerrillas, and they were better at it than the enemy had ever imagined possible. The psychological impact on the Viet Cong was immediate and profound. Captured documents revealed that enemy commanders were struggling to understand what they were facing. The reports they wrote revealed the depth of their terror. One intercepted report described an attack on a supply convoy that left no survivors and no evidence of who had conducted it. The report concluded that the attackers must have been water spirits because no human beings could have approached through the flooded rice paddies without being detected. Another document warned cadres to avoid traveling at night near certain rivers because the Americans have men who can see in the darkness and move without sound. These were not propaganda exaggerations. These were genuine intelligence assessments from terrified commanders. But the most revealing documents came from prisoners. Viet Cong fighters who were captured by SEALs often proved remarkably willing to provide information. This was not because the SEALs used harsh interrogation techniques. It was because the prisoners were simply relieved to be alive. The rumor had spread throughout the Delta that the men with green faces took no prisoners, that they would rise from the water, destroy everyone in their path, and disappear without a trace. Being captured by SEALs was considered a sentence with no appeal. When prisoners discovered they were actually going to survive, the relief often overwhelmed their resistance to questioning. The psychological warfare had become a force multiplier for intelligence collection. One former Viet Cong political officer, interviewed decades after the war, provided a chilling assessment of SEAL operations. He explained that his unit had developed an elaborate early warning system to detect American patrols. None of it worked against the men with green faces. They had scouts positioned along every major approach route. They had villagers who would signal when helicopters were spotted. They had informants inside the South Vietnamese military who provided advance notice of operations. The men with green faces did not use helicopters. They did not follow roads or trails. They did not announce their presence in any way. They simply appeared, as if materializing from the swamp itself, and when they disappeared, people were gone. The political officer admitted something that revealed the true impact. His unit eventually abandoned certain areas entirely because the risk of SEAL operations had become too great. This was exactly what the SEALs had been designed to accomplish. Not the destruction of enemy forces through conventional combat, but the systematic dismantling of enemy infrastructure through precision targeting. Every tax collector who vanished made it harder for the Viet Cong to fund their operations. But the most controversial operations remained hidden from public view. Every political officer who was captured provided intelligence that led to more operations. Every supply line that was interdicted forced the enemy to use longer, more dangerous routes. The SEALs were not fighting a war of attrition. They were fighting a war of decapitation, and they were winning it one target at a time. And then came the program that the Pentagon tried to bury forever. The Phoenix program was officially described as an intelligence coordination effort designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure. The reality was far more complex. Phoenix operations identified high-value targets within the enemy political and military hierarchy, and those targets were then neutralized through various means. Sometimes, neutralization meant arrest and interrogation. Sometimes it meant turning the target into a double agent. And sometimes it meant something the official documents described with clinical euphemism. The target was eliminated with extreme prejudice. The SEALs were not the only forces conducting Phoenix operations. The CIA employed its own assets, and South Vietnamese units played a major role. But when a target was considered particularly high value or particularly well protected, the SEALs often got the call. These missions were the most dangerous and the most classified. What happened on those missions would never appear in any official record. A typical Phoenix operation might involve weeks of surveillance and intelligence gathering, followed by a single night of direct action. The team would infiltrate the target's location, confirm his identity, and then execute the mission objective. If the objective was capture, they would extract the target through the same route they had used for infiltration. If the objective was elimination, they would ensure the target was neutralized and then disappear before anyone could respond. The psychological toll of these missions was significant. SEALs were not assassins by nature or training. They were warriors who had signed up to defend their country, and many of them struggled with operations that felt more like executions than combat. One former SEAL officer, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, described the Phoenix missions as the hardest thing he ever did. He explained that eliminating an enemy soldier in a firefight was one thing. That was combat. That was what he had trained for. But climbing through a window at 3 a.m. changed everything. Putting a suppressed round into a sleeping man was something entirely different. It required a different kind of mental conditioning, and not everyone could make that adjustment. But the program continued because it was producing results. Captured documents showed that the Viet Cong infrastructure in the Mekong Delta was being systematically degraded. Tax collection dropped, recruitment slowed. The invisible hand of Phoenix was squeezing the life out of the insurgency. Informants became harder to control because people were afraid to be seen cooperating with the enemy. Whether this approach was morally justified remains one of the most contentious debates in Vietnam War history. What cannot be debated is that it was effective. The conventional military leadership never quite knew what to make of the SEALs. These operators existed in a twilight zone that no one fully controlled. They existed between the regular chain of command and the shadowy world of intelligence operations. They answered to Naval Special Warfare Command, but they often worked directly for the CIA or for MACVSOG, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group that coordinated all unconventional operations in Southeast Asia. Their missions were compartmentalized, meaning that even senior officers often had no idea what they were doing. Their methods violated nearly every regulation in the book, and their results were undeniable. The tension between SEALs and conventional forces sometimes reached absurd proportions. One famous incident involved a SEAL platoon that was ordered to shave their beards by a visiting Army colonel who was offended by their appearance. The SEALs refused. Their beards were not a fashion statement. What happened next became legend in special operations circles. The facial hair helped break up the outline of their faces during night operations and made them look more like the indigenous Viet Cong fighters, which provided additional psychological cover. The colonel threatened court-martial. The SEAL commanding officer calmly explained that his men were conducting classified operations under direct CIA authority and that the colonel had no jurisdiction over them. The colonel retreated, furious but powerless. The beard stayed. Similar conflicts erupted over every aspect of SEAL operations. SEALs were frequently seen carrying non-standard equipment that technically violated military regulations. They wore enemy equipment captured during operations. They flew on helicopters without registering their missions through normal channels. They operated in areas that were supposedly off-limits to American forces. Every time a conventional officer tried to rein them in, the SEALs would produce authorization from some higher, more secretive authority. The message was clear and uncompromising. These men operated outside the normal rules because their missions required it. The conventional military would simply have to accept it. But the independence came with a price. When things went wrong, the SEALs were often on their own. Medevac helicopters could not be dispatched to locations that officially did not have American troops. And that led to a dark joke that every SEAL understood. Air support could not be called for missions that did not exist in any operational log. The SEALs developed a dark joke about this situation. If you got wounded on a classified mission, you had better hope your teammates could carry you out, because no one else was coming. The joke was funny because it was true, and every SEAL who operated in the Delta understood the stakes. The extraction problem led to some of the most harrowing episodes of the entire war. One patrol, operating deep in enemy territory on a Phoenix mission, encountered a force of approximately 50 Viet Cong fighters who were moving through the same area. The SEALs were outnumbered nearly 8-1, and they were miles from any support. Standard military doctrine would have called for immediate withdrawal and request for reinforcement. But these operators were not operating under standard doctrine. The patrol leader made a decision that exemplified the SEAL mentality. Instead of retreating, they attacked. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The SEALs initiated the ambush with claymore mines positioned along the enemy's line of march, then poured automatic weapons fire into the kill zone from multiple directions. The Viet Cong formation disintegrated under the sudden onslaught. Survivors scattered into the jungle, convinced they had encountered a much larger force. When the firing stopped, the SEALs conducted a rapid assessment, gathered intelligence materials from the enemy casualties, and vanished into the night. They covered 12 kilometers through hostile territory before reaching their extraction point, arriving just as dawn was breaking. The entire operation was never officially recorded because it had taken place in an area where American forces were not supposed to be. This willingness to engage superior forces became another element of the SEAL legend. The Viet Cong learned that numerical superiority provided no guarantee of safety when facing the men with green faces. Even large units would sometimes flee at the first sign of SEAL contact, preferring to abandon their position rather than face the terrifying possibility of close combat with these operators. The psychological warfare had achieved a level of effectiveness that no amount of conventional firepower could match. But the SEALs paid a price for their aggressive tactics. Casualties, while lower than those suffered by conventional units, were still significant. The small size of SEAL teams meant that every loss was felt deeply. A six-man patrol that lost two operators had effectively lost one-third of its combat power. Recovery time was measured in months as replacements had to be brought in and integrated into the team dynamic. The bonds between SEAL operators were forged in blood. The most dangerous moments often came during extraction. After completing a mission, the SEALs would have to navigate back through enemy territory while potentially carrying wounded comrades or prisoners. The Viet Cong understood this vulnerability and would sometimes attempt to intercept SEAL patrols during their withdrawal. These pursuit engagements could be brutal. What happened during these withdrawals tested every limit of human endurance. The SEALs would leapfrog backward, one element providing covering fire, while another moved to the next defensive position. Speed was essential because enemy reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Many SEAL veterans described these fighting withdrawals as the most intense combat experiences of their careers. One such extraction became the subject of a Navy Cross citation that remains partially classified. The patrol had successfully captured a high-value target from a heavily defended compound, but the extraction route had been compromised. Enemy forces were converging from multiple directions. The patrol leader made the decision to fight through rather than surrender the prisoner. Over the next 4 hours, the seven-man team engaged an estimated company-sized enemy force while moving through 3 kilometers of dense vegetation. They called for emergency air support, but the support was delayed. Their location was outside approved operational boundaries. When helicopter gunships finally arrived, they found the SEAL team holding a defensive perimeter around their prisoner, low on ammunition but still fighting. Every member of the team was wounded. None of them had considered abandoning the mission. These stories filtered back to the United States in fragments. The classified nature of SEAL operations meant that their exploits could not be publicized for morale or recruiting purposes. The American public knew that special forces existed, but the specific capabilities of the SEALs remained shrouded in secrecy. This anonymity was deliberate. The effectiveness of the teams depended on the enemy not knowing exactly what they were facing or what they were capable of. But within the military community, the SEAL reputation grew to almost mythical proportions. Soldiers and Marines who had served in the Delta would return stateside with stories about the terrifying pirates who lived in a compound on the river, who went out at night and came back with prisoners or enemy weapons, who seemed to operate under completely different rules than everyone else. These stories were often exaggerated, but the core truth remained. The enemy took notice as well. Captured documents from higher headquarters revealed that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had developed specific countermeasures designed to defeat SEAL operations. These included expanded early warning networks, rapid reaction forces positioned to respond to SEAL contacts, and even bounties offered for the capture or elimination of SEAL operators. The bounties were substantial, reflecting the value that the enemy placed on removing these targets from the battlefield. None of these countermeasures proved particularly effective. The SEALs simply adapted their tactics and continued operating. One of the most significant adaptations involved the integration of Vietnamese personnel into SEAL operations. The Provincial Reconnaissance Units, known as PRUs, were South Vietnamese fighters who had been trained and equipped by the SEALs to conduct similar operations independently. These units provided something the SEALs desperately needed. Valuable language skills and cultural knowledge enhanced SEAL effectiveness. They also served as a force multiplier, allowing the SEALs to cover more territory and conduct more operations than their small numbers would otherwise permit. The relationship between SEALs and PRUs was often described as that between older and younger brothers. The SEALs mentored, trained, and fought alongside their Vietnamese counterparts, building bonds that would last long after the war ended. But the PRU program highlighted a central contradiction of the American involvement. The United States was supposedly fighting to defend South Vietnamese democracy and independence. Yet the most effective operations often involved small groups of Americans leading or advising Vietnamese forces on missions that the South Vietnamese government itself could not conduct independently. The SEALs were winning tactical victories, but those victories were not building the kind of indigenous capacity that would be necessary for South Vietnam to survive on its own. This strategic problem was not something that SEAL operators could solve. Their job was to close with and destroy the enemy. The larger questions of policy and politics were above their pay grade. By 1968, the SEALs had established themselves as the most effective unconventional warfare force in the theater. Their operations had disrupted the Viet Cong infrastructure throughout the Mekong Delta and had forced the enemy to divert significant resources to counter SEAL measures. And then came the Tet Offensive, which revealed a disturbing truth. The Tet Offensive of that year, while a propaganda victory for the Communists, actually demonstrated the degradation that SEAL and Phoenix operations had inflicted. The Viet Cong units that attacked South Vietnamese cities were significantly under strength, and many of their best cadres had been eliminated or captured in the months leading up to the offensive. The infrastructure that was supposed to support the urban uprising had been systematically dismantled. But Tet also marked a turning point that would doom everything. The images of fighting in the streets of Saigon convinced many Americans that the war was unwinnable, regardless of what the military was actually accomplishing on the ground. The political will to continue the conflict began to erode, and with it, the support for operations like Phoenix that were considered too controversial for a democracy to stomach. The SEALs would continue operating for several more years, but the strategic context had fundamentally changed. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to buy time. The final years of SEAL operations in Vietnam were characterized by a desperate intensity. The operators understood that they were running out of time to accomplish their mission, and they pushed themselves and their tactics to the limit. Some of the most audacious operations of the entire war occurred during this period, as SEALs attempted to capture high-value targets and gather intelligence that might somehow change the trajectory of the conflict. These efforts were largely futile in strategic terms, but they produced tactical results that stunned the enemy. One such operation targeted a senior North Vietnamese army officer who was coordinating logistics for communist forces throughout the Delta region. Intelligence indicated that this officer maintained a headquarters in a heavily fortified compound deep in enemy-controlled territory. A conventional attack on the compound would have required a battalion-sized force and would have resulted in significant casualties. The SEALs proposed something that seemed like suicide. A single platoon would infiltrate the compound at night, capture the officer, and extract before the enemy could mount an effective response. The mission was approved, despite reservations from higher headquarters. The SEALs spent 2 weeks preparing, studying aerial photographs of the compound, rehearsing their approach and extraction routes, and coordinating contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. What happened on the night of the operation defied all expectations. On the night of the operation, they inserted by swimmer delivery vehicle an experimental underwater craft that allowed them to approach within striking distance without surfacing. They breached the compound perimeter without alerting the guards and located the target in his sleeping quarters. The extraction was complicated by the unexpected presence of additional enemy personnel, but the SEALs adapted on the fly. They eliminated threats as they encountered them and maintained control of the prisoner throughout. They reached their extraction point with minutes to spare before dawn, having captured one of the most valuable intelligence sources of the entire war. The prisoner's subsequent interrogation produced information that would influence American operations for months. Maps, codebooks, communication procedures, and detailed order of battle information were all recovered or extracted from this single target. The success validated everything the SEALs had been advocating since their arrival in Vietnam. Small, highly trained units could accomplish what conventional forces could not, and they could do it at a fraction of the cost in lives and resources. But even these successes could not change the fundamental reality. The United States was withdrawing from Vietnam, and no amount of tactical brilliance could alter that political decision. The SEALs began reducing their presence in 1970. By 1971, most direct action operations had ceased. The final SEAL advisors departed in 1973, leaving behind their Vietnamese counterparts to face the coming storm alone. For many SEALs, this abandonment of their allies would remain a source of profound guilt and anger for the rest of their lives. The statistics of SEAL operations in Vietnam tell only part of the story. Official records credit the teams with several hundred confirmed enemy casualties and dozens of high-value targets captured or eliminated. These numbers are almost certainly understated, given the classified nature of many operations and the difficulty of confirming results in the chaotic environment of the Delta. More significant than the body count was the psychological impact. The SEALs had demonstrated something that changed everything. They had proven that the Viet Cong infrastructure was not untouchable, that even the most protected cadres could be reached, and that the enemy's control over the population was not absolute. The legacy of Vietnam SEAL operations would shape the future of American special operations for decades to come. The tactics developed in the Mekong Delta became the foundation for everything that followed. The lessons learned about small unit operations in complex terrain informed doctrine across all special operations forces. And the myth of the men with green faces, the water warriors who could appear anywhere and accomplish anything, became a recruiting tool that attracted generations of young Americans to the SEAL community. But perhaps the most significant legacy was psychological. The Vietnam-era SEALs had proven something that many military theorists had doubted. They had shown that properly selected, trained, and led special operations forces could achieve strategic effects far out of proportion to their numbers. They had demonstrated that unconventional warfare was not just a sideshow, but a potentially decisive element of modern conflict. The enemy's assessment ultimately proved the most telling verdict. Decades after the war ended, former Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army officers continued to describe the SEALs in terms that bordered on supernatural. They were the men who breathed underwater, the devils with green faces, the phantoms who came from the river and took people away. These descriptions were not literal, but they captured something essential about what the SEALs had accomplished. They had become the embodiment of fear itself, and that fear had proven more powerful than any weapon in the American arsenal. The rivers of the Mekong Delta have changed in the half-century since the last SEALs departed. The canals are wider now, the mangrove forests thinner, the villages larger and more connected to the modern world. But if you talk to the older residents, the ones who remember the war, they still speak of those years with a particular kind of dread. They remember the nights when no one dared travel the waterways. They remember the mornings when someone important had simply vanished. They remember the whispered warnings about the Americans who could see in the dark and move without sound. The men with green faces have become part of the folklore now, joining the spirits and legends that have always haunted this landscape. But unlike those ancient myths, the stories of the SEALs are true. Every word of them. And here is the final truth that the Pentagon never wanted to acknowledge. The SEALs did not lose in Vietnam. The politicians lost. The strategists lost. The American public lost its will to continue. But in the rivers and swamps and villages of the Mekong Delta, the men with green faces remained undefeated. They accomplished every mission they were assigned. They adapted to every challenge they faced. They became the most effective, unconventional warfare force in the history of American arms. And when they finally departed, it was not in retreat, but in obedience to orders from leaders who had failed to match their courage and commitment. The Viet Cong called them the men who breathe underwater. Perhaps that was the most accurate description of all, because the SEALs had learned to survive and thrive in an environment that destroyed everyone else. They had become something more than soldiers, more than special operators, more than even the elite warriors they were trained to be. They had become legends, and legends never truly fade. They simply wait beneath the surface, ready to rise again when the nation calls. The water of the Mekong still flows to the sea, carrying with it the sediment of 1,000 battlefields. Somewhere in that flow are traces of the men who fought there, Americans and Vietnamese alike, their blood and sweat long since dissolved into the eternal current. But the memory remains, in the villages along the river, in the archives of the Pentagon, in the nightmares of those who faced the men with green faces and survived to tell the tale. This is their story, as complete as it can be told, though some chapters remain classified to this day. The whisper of their legacy echoes still across the decades. 7 men in black pajamas, rising from the water in the dead of night, changing the course of a war one mission at a time. They were the original quiet professionals, the first generation of a brotherhood that continues to serve in the shadows of every conflict. And they earned their place in history the hardest way possible, by being so good at what they did that even their enemies had to acknowledge their mastery. The men who breathe underwater. The devils with green faces, the phantoms of the Mekong. Call them what you will. The Navy SEALs of Vietnam wrote a chapter of military history that will never be forgotten, even if it can never be fully told. Their war ended half a century ago, but their legend lives on, inspiring new generations of warriors to reach for that same impossible standard of excellence. That is their true victory, and it is one that no politician, no strategist, and no enemy could ever take away. In the end, the most classified secret of the Vietnam War was also the simplest. A small group of dedicated men, properly trained and led, could accomplish miracles. They could strike fear into an enemy that outnumbered them hundreds to one. They could operate in terrain that was supposed to be impossible for Americans. They could win battles that the conventional military could not even attempt. And they could do it all while maintaining a code of brotherhood and excellence that became the foundation for everything that followed. The Mekong Delta is quiet now. The rivers flow peacefully, and the fishermen go about their work without fear of what might rise from the water in the night. But the old stories persist, passed down from generation to generation, warnings and wonders in equal measure. The Americans sent many soldiers to Vietnam, the elders say. Most of them were ordinary men, brave but limited, powerful but clumsy. But some of them were different. Some of them were not ordinary at all. Those were the ones who came from the water, and those were the ones we learned to fear.